Turn it up. Look, 100 years after 100 years, they done lied to us about this and that. Told us all we from Africa. I made fiction characters turn into facts. Heard you tell me then it was not. Knowing goddamn well that trick was capped. My wife and I wrote a book about it. It's a book with knowledge, evidence, and fact. And my other book got them haters shook, cause it's helping mind people take a closer look at their backgrounds in the background, showing my people where they supposed to look. Showing my people where they get it from, where they hit it from, all sorts of angles. When it comes to this research, you must please first, don't trust strangers. Find out all on your own is what I highly recommend and suggest. And if you looking for answers and content about me, I highly recommend you the best. Which is my website at the link you see just across the screen. Don't let it miss you. I make it simple. I double down on that black and white. It's too official.
You support reparations for black people?
Well, listen, again, we had over 200 years of slavery. We had Jim Crow for almost a century. We had legalized discrimination and segregation, and now we have segregation and discrimination that is not legal but still exists and is a barrier to progress. We have disparities around housing. We have disparities around education. We have disparities around income. And we have to recognize that everybody did not start out on an equal footing in this country. And in particular, black people have not. 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 And so we have got to recognize that and do something about that and give folks a lift up. That's why, for example, I'm proposing the LIFT Act. Give people who are making $100,000 or less as a family a tax credit, which will benefit and uplift 60% of black families who are in poverty.
So by default, it affects black families, but there's not a particular policy for African Americans that you would explore.
But no, if you look at the reality of who will benefit from certain policies, when you take into account that they're not starting at the same place and they're not starting on equal footing, it will directly benefit black children, black families, black homeowners, because the disparities are so significant. So if we focus on the specific issues that have resulted in the greatest disparities, and we understand that that's part of why we're doing it. Listen, the reality also is this: any policy that will benefit black people will benefit all of society. Let's be clear about that. Let's really be clear about that. So I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No, because whatever benefits that black family will benefit that community and society as a whole and the country. Right? 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 Right?
Your poll numbers with African Americans were quite low, and you also don't support reparations for slave descendants. Why do you think your poll numbers are low, and why don't you support reparations?
I think what we have got to do is pay attention to distressed communities, black communities, Latino communities, and white communities all over this country. And as president, I pledge to do that.
Why not support reparations then?
Well, what do you mean by reparations?
By reparations for slave defendants.
I know, but what does that mean exactly?
Money.
Well, I think that right now our job is to address the crises facing the American people and our communities. And I think there are better ways to do that than just writing out a check.
Well, Georgetown sociology professor Michael Eric Dyson has a solution to white privilege. He says white Americans ought to create individual reparations accounts to compensate black Americans for centuries of oppression. Professor Dyson joins us now to explain how that would work and why. Professor, great to see you.
Good to see you, my friend.
So how would this work and why?
Well, it's in the context, let me just briefly say, it's in the context of a much broader discussion about white privilege, white innocence, white American identity, and it's much more complicated than that, and I go at African American culture's contradictions as well. And then in the end, when I'm making suggestions about what can be done, many white people approach me and ask me, what can I do? Not in terms of the broad social transformation out there in the world. We all believe in that, or or argue about it, redistribution of resources or not. But when people ask me, what can I as an individual do, one of the things I suggested, besides being educated, besides participating with other African American and Latino and other brothers and sisters in social movement, is to do something called an individual repair of inequality. And if they feel inclined to do so, this is for people who are so inclined to seek out a way to compensate individually for what they think is a systemic injustice. So I talked about buying kids computers, being able to take kids to school, to tutor them, to be able to do individual things that are tailored to their desires and aspirations, such as becoming professionals, exposing them to things they wouldn't ordinarily see. So in other words, it's a kind of ethic of compassion joined to a sense of conscience that motivates them to do what they're motivated to do.
Well, so I support a lot of that. I mean, I believe in charity. What I don't believe in is collective guilt. And that's why I'm confused by the phrase white privilege.
Well, white privilege doesn't suggest guilt. It suggests responsibility and accountability. The same accountability that America talks to about people pulling up themselves by their bootstraps and addressing their situations, their communities, as being responsible for doing what they're doing. I don't believe in collective guilt, but I do believe in collective responsibility.
Responsibility and guilt are synonyms in this case. And let me just ask, let's be specific. So, privilege. I'm privileged, and I wouldn't deny that, not because I'm white, because I have a good-paying job. But you're privileged, too.
Of course.
So we live near each other in a nice neighborhood. You're rich. You went to an Ivy League school, unlike me. And so you're way more privileged than most white Americans.
Well,
so why would they open
but it's not
something?
Well, first of all, privilege is contingent upon the context in which it's defined. So individual cases could have an imbalance, that people of color could be way more privileged, as you talked about, than the average, say, white person. But remember, during Jim Crow, Jackie Robinson was more privileged than most white people in terms of having the ability to make a good living on a job, but he was still denied access to a water fountain. His kids still couldn't go to the same school. So I'm saying to you that your argument then seems to be rather vulnerable to rebuff, because it doesn't mean economic accumulation can prevent you from experiencing what are essentially racial inequalities. So the amount of money you have doesn't do that.
Yeah, and in 1955, I think that was much truer than it is now.
Well, even now, when we talk about the disparities in terms of people's achievement, a study was done by Diva Pager at Princeton University that said a black person with a college education had less of a chance to get a job than a white person who had gone to prison. So even now, I'm not talking about 50 years ago, I'm talking about this is going on right now. The disparities are very real.
Right. So if I live in eastern Kentucky and I am unemployed, why am I more privileged than you? And why am I in any way, as you put it, responsible for problems of people I've never met on the other side of the country?
Look, I mean, we know that larger forces provide people opportunities or disadvantages. When you come, many people say, let me even stretch it even further. Some people say, look, I came to this country 20 years ago. I came to this country 30 years ago. I wasn't advantaged directly by the system of enslavement that prevailed in America. But if you come to this country as an immigrant and you're a white immigrant and you inherit certain privileges associated with people who are already here, that means that privilege extends to you regardless of the fact that you indirectly benefited from it and you did not directly contribute to inequality. The Constitution was written a long time ago, so was the Declaration of Independence. But those ancient documents continue to inform people's lives and shape their aspirations.
So let me flip it around. And let me just also note there's a lot of hostility in what you're saying. And I'm sure you'll say there isn't, but obviously there is.
Not at all.
I think it's pretty clear.
It's recognition of the situation.
Okay.
It's pushback on whiteness that is usually not called out.
Clearly hostile. But leaving that aside, I'll flip around for a second. If I'm an African immigrant who comes here, I'm resettled from Somalia at public expense, high public expense, am I due these reparations too?
I think that the people who have benefited from systemic inequity in this country have been overwhelmingly white brothers and sisters, and what I'm talking about is a direct relationship to a notable and a documentable and an empirically verifiable system of inequality. There's nothing that's very obscure about that, and I'm saying to you that people of color who are here now, who have inherited that legacy as a result of their black skin and their relationship to black culture have to be acknowledged.
Well, wait,
my book is not simply about reparations. You're reducing
I know that it's not.
But so much larger.
It's heavily about privilege. But let me just we're almost out of time.
It's about white refusal to acknowledge
responsibility. If a majority white country brings in a black African at its own expense, they still owe him reparations for slavery?
No, I'm talking about the people who are here. That's an isolated event. I'm talking about the majority of African American people who are here, who are part and parcel of what this country has been, and who have built it in its institutions to become what it is now.
I am very thankful to see that many of you took a lot of what I stated in my last video and immediately began to research further along. Lots of you have hit my inbox in reference to what I shared about the differences between immigrants and immigrants, for example, and I am very, very pleased with those of you who knows that a 3.5-second Google search is not real research, but would be considered that way by some only if that individual is limited with expanding their leads and, of course, resource materials. So I'll share more information about it now. The 1828 Webster's English Dictionary states that the noun immigrant, spelled with the letter E, is, quote, one who removes his habitation or quits one country or region to settle in another, while the noun immigrant, spelled with an I, is, quote, a person that removes into a country for the purpose of permanent residence. Now, subscribing to the standard definition of these words makes you conclude that they both mean the same. But most of you who are cognizant of the spells of the English language would know better. Some of you would notice that the definition of immigrate with the letter E would determine that it means exit. And the definition of the word immigrate, spelled with the letter I, would determine that it means to come into, due to both Latin origins of each word. But here's the problem with that. A country is not a continent, and a continent is not a country, state, nor region of a territory. You can recall that in the first video, I shared that the definition of the word immigrant, spelled with the letter E, means people who moves from one region of a country to live in another region of that same country, which derives from its etymology, to remove from one state to another state or territory. This is not hard. Region, be it the states of the country called North America. But isn't North America a continent? Or is it really? But that's for a different time. America is being considered as both by lots of people right now, taking the advice of strangers without managing to actually look it up for themselves. Even the etymology of the word immigrate, spelled with the letter I, informs you that it means to, quote, pass into a place as a new inhabitant or resident. Listen closely. To move to a country where one is not a native for the purposes of settling permanently there. Now, does that sound peaceful to you all or something? It says for the purpose of settling permanently there as a resident and not a native of that landmass. This is why the word remove was used in Webster's definition, because there were wars going on here, and if you become a prisoner, then things get taken away from you. Confiscated. Prisoner of war. You may have heard me mention this multiple times already, but I know some of you newly incoming viewers might not know it yet, and that's fine. This is the reason why I share even more detailed information when I feel as though you may haven't gotten around to researching it just yet. So with all things considered, the driving principles of the ADOS agenda reveals it as, yes, another distraction. A distraction from the actual proof of whether you are an American descendant or an African descendant of slavery, or neither. Slavery did not happen the way we were all told throughout compulsory educational institutions that derived directly from the Reconstruction era of the 1900s. There were political and commercial groups, businesses, and banks who were responsible for granting permission to anthropologists and the power of eugenics to create, cultivate and influence the reconstructed history they gave to you. The narrative that you are accustomed to now stems from employees of those who wrote the manuscripts you draw from. Slavery used in its proper context is simply labor, servitude. This is why most people would commonly believe today that slavery was abolished in 1865, when it was merely upgraded and transitioned from a bondage standpoint to an industrialized version that runs parallel along the lines of capitalism. In other words, they gave you forced schooling in order to indoctrinate you with whatever it is they want you to know, in order to make you think slavery was one way, when in reality, slavery is still ongoing the exact same today as if it was in the past. Employment. There were no chains and shackles then, and there are no chains and shackles now. At least not visibly, because some of you failed to realize that the chains and shackles were placed upon your mindsets. What is the Emancipation Proclamation? Many of my viewers will recall it as the time when President Abraham Lincoln freed all of the slaves of North America. Multiple history professors and scholars would agree with you. Even some websites would state that the Emancipation Proclamation, or Proclamation 95, changed the federal legal status of more than 3.5 million enslaved African Americans in the designated areas of the South, from slave to free. However, when you actually read an original copy of Proclamation 95, you will not find any legislation throughout the context of the document where it clearly states that it was created in order to free blacks, coloreds, or African Americans from slavery. Proclamation 95 was a call to end existing public upheavals and riots that were taking place during that time period over a labor dispute. Complaints were arising from the laborers who worked long periods of hours for little to nothing nowadays, or for being promised something for their labor, but the other party didn't hold up to their end of the bargain, gradually transforming the laborers into prisoners of war, realizing that they were being used in order to create and establish the 13 colonies. In fact, the funds which were needed in order to maintain and regulate the 13 colonies were not being generated. So this forced 11 of the southern states to back out of a bad business deal, succeeding themselves from the Union. Then a new union was created, called the Confederate States of America. However, in order to keep the membership of these confederacies, they imposed limitations upon the resigning party's rights, just like any union would today. This was all done through a proclamation to blockade southern states from trading along the waterways. And by doing this, the United States government was able to stop commerce and shipments of products such as rice, corn, grain, and tobacco, just to name a few, from leaving the southern regions of the United States. When I mentioned a bad business deal earlier, this is what I was referring to. And so now you know what the Civil War was truly about. It was a civil dispute amongst employees that were tired of being treated unfairly within their place of employment. It was all about civil rights, inequality in the workplace, fights over improper land grants, tariffs, and trade disputes among settlers and squatters. All gave way to a secession of Confederate states and a broken union. In its simplest form, this was merely a labor dispute.
At the Okeechobee labor camp, while families were preparing to move north, there was still some work in the bean fields. Children, as usual, were left to fend for themselves.
Jerome, how old are you?
9.
9? Do you go to school?
Yes.
Where do you go to school, Jerome?
At the Okeechobee Elementary School.
I see. What is your sister's name?
Lois.
That's Lois. And what are your other sisters' names?
Catherine and Beulah.
Catherine and Beulah. What happened to your foot, Jerome?
dig a nail in out there by the wash house.
So you drove a nail in out by the wash house. What did your mother do for that?
She put some alcohol on it.
Where do you sleep, Jerome?
In this bed.
You have this big bed?
Yes.
What happened? How did you get that hole in that bed there, Jerome?
The rats.
The what?
Rats.
Now, Jerome, you are taking care of Kathy, of Beulah, and Lois.
Yes.
Now, are you going to give them lunch today?
Yes.
What are you going to feed them?
I don't know.
Do you have any food here to give them?
Yes.
I see. What time does your mother come home?
I don't know.
The following day, Arlene King, the mother of Jerome, Kathy, Lois, and Beulah, again was picking beans.
Aileen King, I saw your children yesterday at the Okeechobee camp. Why didn't you put them in the nursery?
I don't make enough to pay for it.
How much does it cost to put them in?
85 cents.
85 cents.
That's right.
Aileen, what time did you come out the field this morning?
6 o'clock.
What time would you get home?
About 3:30, 4 o'clock.
6 this morning to 4 o'clock this afternoon.
That's right.
How much did you earn?
$1.
$1?
That's right. $1.
Is that because the beans were of poor quality?
That's right.
Has this happened before?
That's right.
How much will your food cost you today?
About $2.
Aileen, how old are you?
29.
How many children do you have?
14.
How old were you when you first started working in the fields?
8.
You've been working 21 years in the fields?
That's right.
Aileen, do you ever think you'll be able to get out of this kind of work?
No, sir. No, sir. No, sir.
The Civil War was a labor dispute that was inevitably tied to American Indian lands. And for this reason, a scheme was devised where the people on the bottom will be able to create a flip-flop that resulted in their eventual rise to the top. More about this in my documentary series called African Americans Are a Big Threat to American Society. But I stated that to say this: our people were always home, even when the Industrial Revolution began. Our ancestors were the ones prospering. We owned the lands, lakes, rivers, businesses, and the banks. And most importantly, we were well aware of how and where to get the resources needed to sustain the continued growth of our success and the success of Turtle Island, aka North America. So, how does an immigrant remove an indigenous person and replace themselves as a permanent resident?
Do you realize that there was an agreement made between our people way before the people without color got here? The black people agreed that they would sacrifice and do the slavery thing for us, or we would have been completely wiped out. We owe them such a debt. Don't be caught up in American racism. They don't want us to unite and be together because they're afraid of that we'll treat them the way they treated us. We're human beings. We could never be that thoughtless, and we don't have to worry about that because from the way things look, they're going to self-destruct. A lot of them are spinning out of control. We're not even going to have to do anything. We might have to put a few of them out of their misery, but...
According to a well-known anthropologist by the name of Margaret Mead, you don't come into a place with an attitude of entitlement, because people generally enjoy when you learn their language and their culture. As long as you come into a place ready to learn and join their society, it's okay. It's very flattering for all people when someone wants to be taught. And also, Margaret Mead stated, quote, "You have to do something pretty terrible to people before they come to regard you as a spy, rather than an interested explorer." And that is exactly what they did when they adopted our ancestors' constitutions and created confederacies that reflected our ancestors' form of government. The Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union was a set of laws which was used to form the first U.S. government in the year 1777. This was based on the information learned by the foreigners and through Indian relations. Each Indian tribe had its own confederacy and its own constitution, and they had a commander, which was the chief. This form of government allowed for the individual sovereignty of each tribe to take place and not to be imposed upon. It also allowed for trade relations outside of the tribe to take place amongst those who are the heads or chiefs of the tribe or clan. And this is the idea that the 13 colonies took for themselves. They created the Articles of Confederation, not as colonies, but as confederacies. There was a confederacy for each state, and this is why there is also a constitution for each state. This is also why when they separated from the Union that they called themselves the Confederate States of America. The colonies of the United States created a confederacy and a union which had the duty to, quote, enter into a firm league of friendship with each other for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare, binding themselves to assist each other against all force offered to or attacks made upon them or any of them on account of religion, sovereignty, trade, or any other pretense whatsoever. And they used a formal setting known as Congress to resolve their disputes. Congress is defined as a formal assembly of 2 or more representatives, ambassadors, or nations that comes together to discuss problems. Sound familiar? The House of Representatives, Congress, a commander-in-chief. And because these foreign confederacies were so few in numbers alongside the large amount of Indian confederacies, they decided to form a union, which is short for trade union or labor union, that ensures they would always be together for a common purpose. In most cases, the American Indian clans or tribes allegedly agreed to sign treaties with foreigners, or rather a foreign government, to ensure peaceful cooperation between themselves, dating back to the latter part of the 1770s. This is also around the time when our own people were pitted against each other for the purposes of disloyalty and betrayal, and the colonization of our people through paper genocide. Of course, this was all politics. So, the start of the Civil War was the very first government shutdown because it was declared a state of emergency, whereas the commander-in-chief takes supreme authority and decides what could possibly settle the dispute and get everyone working together again. All of this leads back to the Emancipation Proclamation, and according to the original documents, which is listed in an exhibit for the National Archives, it reads that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforward and forever free. It also states that, and I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence unless in necessary self-defense, and I recommend to them that in all cases when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. Which truly lets you know that slavery, as we were all taught in school, is royally incorrect. Because you can't let a slave know what slavery was all about. Then that person will realize that he or she may still be a slave now. I'm just here to make you think.